Hello and welcome. I'm excited because today I get a chance to talk to you about one of my favorite features in Excel if you're using Office Pro Premium, and that is PowerPivot. So, most people that work in Excel have at least heard the term pivot table before, and we know a lot of the benefits that pivot tables bring to us. So, to give you an example of what we can do with pivot tables, just regular old pivot tables. We have a list of data here, and this is real estate data. So these are a list of homes that are for sale or that have been sold, a little bit of information about them, like their size, number of bedrooms and bathrooms, how much it sold for, and the agent that sold it. Okay. So if I was working with just a regular old pivot table here, I could very quickly create something that we can work with. So when I create that pivot table, I've got all these different fields over here. So for example, I can take the agent, I can take the sale price of the house, and it very quickly tells me the values that we've sold. So who was the most lucrative, and we can see that very, very quickly. Okay, pretty quickly. Now, what's not beneficial or what you can't do with a regular pivot table that makes Power Pivot so special is this. So I've got another file here. And this other file has the listing agents names along with the listing agents IDs. So this agent ID number here is the same agent ID number that I have here. So if I'm creating a pivot table and I'm looking at agent performance, maybe we can look at the number 1057 and know who that agent is. But it would be so helpful if instead of using this 1057 that corresponds with the data that's here, we could somehow replace that with the name of the actual agent. Well, with a regular old pivot table, there's nothing you're going to be able to do with this. When you create the pivot table, the data that's here is the data that goes into it, and that's really it. Okay. Now, what's special about this, or what's different when you're working with Excel, and I'm just going to, you know what, let's create a table out of this. And let's just talk about some things that we can do. So when you're working with Excel, when you're working with a regular old pivot table, you're limited to the amount of data that you can use, meaning that the data that you're using needs to live on one singular worksheet. So if I wanted to make a pivot table just out of this, I can, but I don't have the ability to use any data or any kind of relationships from any other space. Thus, the downfall of a regular old pivot table. Now, when you're working with PowerPivot, PowerPivot is an add-on to Excel, and what it gives you the ability to do is make a data model using the columnar database that drives underneath Excel. So basically, I can add multiple table objects or multiple data sources to this underlying data model in Excel. I can create relationships between those multiple data sources, and then I can create some kind of visualization, be it a pivot table or something else, based on those. So it's really, really quite something. Okay. So at its basic level, the difference between a regular pivot table and this Power Pivot feature is it gives you the ability to create a pivot table based on multiple diverse data sources. Okay. So what we're going to do is, in order to use Power Pivot, we first have to turn it on. So I'm going to go backstage. I'm going to go down to my options. I'm going to go to add-ins, Excel add-ins. We're going to switch that to COM add-ins, and we're going to turn on Power Pivot for Excel. And when we do that, boom, we get Power Pivot up here. And from there, you'll see we've got a new option here called Data Model and Manage, right? That's working there. So now what I'm going to do, and there are actually several ways that we can do this, but I'm going to go ahead and select this data, and I'm going to click Add to Data Model. And when I do, you'll see Power Pivot for Excel open up, and you'll see the actual data model. And this is the data model with that first table added. Okay. So here's my data model of all my sales data with that first table added. So now I like this so far, so I'm going to go ahead and save this and exit Power Pivot. And as a little bonus here, let's talk about what's coming up next. We need to somehow either connect or import that CSV file that has all of our agents' names in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Data tab, and I'm actually going to use Power Query, which is another power tool within Excel, to connect to that CSV file and add it to the data model. So I'm going to go import, or excuse me, get and transport from text CSV. I've got that file saved on my desktop, so we're going to go in and find that file, which is here. We're going to click import, and it's going to open up the Power Query editor. So I look at my data and I decide if it's properly formatted, which it is, so we don't need to do any additional transformations. By the way, I've got another video that talks about Power Query and the PQE along with business intelligence. So as of right now, I'm just going to load this file, but when I do, I'm not just going to load it, I'm going to select load to. And when I do that, I have an option of adding it to the data model and then also putting it on a new worksheet, which we're going to do. And you see it's brought it in as a table. We'll call this worksheet agents. We'll call this worksheet sales. And just to make sure we do due diligence here, we're going to go ahead and name this table 1. We'll call that table 1 sales. And this one should already be named because we used Power Query to bring it in, which it is, which is agents. Okay, so we've got 2 separate data sources, right? We've got our original table here. We've got our agents table here. Well, this agent ID that appears right here, that's the same agent ID that appears here. So what you've got here is something called a common field. Okay, so it's a field or a relational value that live in 2 different tables that basically are the same data, right? So 2141 is agent with the last name Hicks. So what we have the ability to do, similar to if you're creating a database, is we can go into PowerPivot, okay, and we can create a relationship that says that this agent ID is the same agent ID in sales, okay, and we don't need this pivot table that we were creating earlier, okay. So now there's 2 different ways we can do this. Create a relationship inside Excel using PowerPivot. So I can go to PowerPivot, go to Data Model and select Manage. Okay. Now when I do that, I can then click Design. And from Design, I can go to Create Relationship. That's one way to do this. Okay. Now I want to point out that there's more than one way to create relationships in Excel. Now since this video is about PowerPivot, or the beginning of PowerPivot, I want to show you how to do that from inside PowerPivot for Excel, right here. But there is another way to do it from inside the ribbon in Excel, and I'll show you that in a minute. But ultimately, it still will lead you to PowerPivot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click Create Relationship. And I've got my 2 tables, right? So I've got table 1, and then I've got my agent demo inside my data model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to link up the, wherever we live here, agent ID to agent ID. So we're saying here to here, and I click OK. And we've created a relationship. Now, if we want to see what that looks like, we can click Manage Relationships. And we can see that we've got a one-to-many relationship between agent in the table 1 and agent in the demo table. Okay. So let's go ahead and click Close. And the next thing I want to show you is how to do this from the other section in the ribbon. So we're going to go to Close, PowerPivot, and we're going to go Home. And actually not from home, we're going to go to data. And from data, you'll see you actually have the same option here. You've got relationships, right? So when I click that, I have the ability to click new, and I can do that very same thing. So let's take a quick second and talk about relationships for a moment. And I could go into this quite a bit, but you'll hear the term foreign key quite a bit. You'll hear the term primary key quite a bit, and you'll hear one-to-many thrown out quite a bit. So I would suggest you go back and watch my video on databases and access to really know a lot about data normalization, primary keys, foreign keys, things like that. But let me just give you a quick once-over on how this works. So what is a table in a database? Well, a table is a collection of fields, right? Fields have values, and a group of related field values is a record. Every record inside a table has to have a unique identifier that allows the database program to find it. That unique identifier is called a primary key. Primary keys cannot repeat, and primary keys cannot be null. And in this case, the primary key of the agents table is agent ID. Could it be agent name? It actually could, but it's not a good idea to do that because there could be two people that have the same last name. Like Davidson's a really common last name. So you wouldn't want to do that when you're designing your data structure. It would be better to use a number that obviously can't repeat, okay? Primary key. In my sales table, my lot number is my primary key, okay? So this number over here. That number can't repeat. That's the number that we use to identify each one of these actual addresses, which you could use address if you wanted. But in this case, we're using this first option here. So you see that agent appears here and agent also appears here. Well, this agent that appears inside my agents table is only ever going to appear one time. You wouldn't repeat name list that agent more than once if it's just a data set of agent information. But that agent can sell as many houses as they want. So what that tells you is that key can repeat as many times as it wants inside this sales table. That's what you call a one-to-many relationship. Now on top of that, because this agent field here is the primary key inside the agents table, that makes it the foreign key inside the sales table. So now when I look at my relationships here, if I edit this, you'll see that the related table of agents demo, so agents demo primary key agent, is the foreign key relationship in the data model table 1, which is what we created already. Okay. So now when you're working in PowerPivot, if you're working with relational data, that's the first thing you have to do. Connect your data and then link your data together using those relationships. Now here comes the win. So I've gone back in PowerPivot. So if I create a pivot table, so I see I'm inside PowerPivot, I go to Home, you go to Pivot Table. When I create a pivot table, and we'll just put it on a new sheet, and we'll just call it Report. Okay. What you're going to see that's different from what we had before is that I actually have this data model table and table 1 for my data model, and I can pull information from both of them. So all of a sudden, I can take my agent name, which I couldn't do before, and I get Davidson, Hicks, Ranger, Vaughn, Wellington. But now I can take my house cost and I can pop that down there, and ooh, look at that. All of a sudden, I'm able to pull data from my original agents table and model that together with summary data or aggregate data from a different table. So one of the big benefits you get from using PowerPivot, and there's more than one thing, is that it gives you the ability to build your pivot table based on multiple diverse data sources. And in the eyes of the user at the end, you don't see the difference. So I pulled name from the agent demo table, and I pulled cost from the table, which was our sales table. One of the big benefits of working with PowerPivot. Now, there's a couple other things you get with PowerPivot that are really, really great. So one of the big things you'll get with PowerPivot is if I go back in, I actually get the ability, and we'll talk about this in a couple other videos, to create key performance indicators, KPIs, as well as digital measures. Now, you can do something very similar to this when you're working in a regular pivot table. So you've got a couple options that you can do with calculated fields and columns in regular pivot tables. But you get some additional features here with KPIs and measures. You also have the ability to write DAX, which stands for Data Analysis Expressions, inside the PowerPivot for Excel window. So I can add a calculated field here, which will actually add data that I can build into my pivot table model. I can also write expressions down here using DAX that I can use as calculations to also add into my PowerPivot model. So now we'll make a couple other videos on KPIs and on writing some basic DAX in Excel. But for now, hopefully, that's a good introduction into what you can do with PowerPivot. So again, just to quickly summarize, you can take multiple data sources, build them into the columnar database, which is the data modeling database that's underneath Excel when you're using PowerPivot, and then model those just like a regular old pivot table. And the benefit is this data and this data don't have to be on the same page. You could really connect to them, so they don't even have to be in the same document. You could connect to multiple sources using Power Query, and then you model them just like so, just to keep them simple. Now, everything that you can do with a regular pivot table, you can do with a Power Pivot table. So, for example, if you wanted a pivot slicer, you could absolutely do that based on agent name. So if I just want to see Hicks, I can. If I want to see Vong, I can. If this had numerical data in it, I could use a timeline, although it doesn't have that kind of data. Not numerical. If it had time-based data or time intelligence features in it, we could use the timeline option. We don't, so we can only use a regular slicer. But basically, at its simplest level, Power Pivot 101. So hopefully we'll see you back soon for the second part of what we can do with Power Pivot using DAX. We'll do some KPIs. We'll do some calculated measures. Maybe we'll connect pivot slicers to multiple areas inside our worksheet. So until then, we will talk to you soon.